My name is Dr. Ann Harrington, and I am a senior lecturer, which in the US is an associate professor of politics and international relations at Cardiff University, which is located in Wales in the United Kingdom. And I've been on the faculty there for since 2016, so approximately 6 years. I teach classes there on nuclear politics, on gender and international politics, on war and society. But nuclear politics is my main focus. It's something that I have been working on and off throughout my career since I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago. My area of expertise is in nuclear deterrence and nonproliferation. What I am interested in really are the processes through which what I would call value or meaning gets attached to the object that we think of or know as a nuclear weapon. And so I've worked on that idea from various angles and in different ways over the years. So there was a period of time in which behavioral economics was something that was very prominent within the public discourse in the US, kind of after the 2007 financial crash, where people were thinking through the neoliberal model of economics in a new way, and behavioral economics was very influential. Well, behavioral economics also has a lot to say about nuclear deterrence. So I did an edited volume with Jeff Knopf on that. And it's something that continues to generate a lot of interest, but it's a way of thinking through how we think about the role of nuclear weapons in relationship to human systems, for a lack of a better way to put it, and sort of rethinking. So, I critique the model of what we call Homo atomicus in that, the conclusion of that book. I also have worked more explicitly on those roles and processes in my work on nuclear fetishism. And fetishism is a process by which meaning is attached to objects, but it results in a inversion or a reversal whereby we think that the meaning comes from the object, when in fact it is assigned by the system it's part of, right? So it's a process of uncovering or denaturing. So that's another place where I look at these things. I also sometimes write more explicitly about how these processes relate to nuclear weapons in different policy contexts. So for instance, the Iran nuclear deal is something that I've been quite interested in, and how nuclear weapons take on diplomatic meaning. Yeah. So I became interested in studying nuclear weapons for a couple of reasons. I started on this topic back in the early 2000s, and that was a period of time when I was getting my PhD in the US context, where politically and in the public realm, we were very much in the afterglow of the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The US was very interested in the expansion of NATO. Nuclear weapons had more or less fallen off the national agenda, right? The arms race with the Soviet Union was quote unquote over. And so it wasn't something people were studying a lot at the time. So it was a little bit of an unusual choice back when I started. But the reason that nuclear weapons were interesting to me initially was because they cause a lot of problems for realism. Realism defines power in such a way that they operationalize it explicitly in terms of military force. Some realists do that more reductively than others, but if you do that, nuclear weapons create a really interesting problem for understanding how to operationalize power within those theories, because they're at once the most powerful object on Earth and completely useless, right? So they kind of it's almost as if they're a symptom of an underlying issue in the way that we're conceptualizing the relationship between violence and power. And so a lot of my work is unpacking that relationship. So that's the first thing that interested me about them. But the second thing was that I got some advice that was essentially that when you think about the trajectory of an intellectual career or an academic career, it can be satisfying to choose an area of study that has a lot of practical application, in part because that also gives you a link up to real world problems. It gives you something to say about things that are happening day to day. And so the other thing that I really liked about studying nuclear weapons is that they connect you to epistemological questions about what it is to be human. What does it mean that we as a species are able to destroy our own planet? Right? So these really big kind of philosophical questions. It connects you up to a whole lot of questions about theory that I've already talked about a little bit, around ideas about problems for realism, or how do we construct meaning and value, right? If we look at constructivist theories. But it also then connects you up to a lot of real world questions about what do we have to say about US policy towards Iran, right? What kinds of policies might produce the types of outcomes we'd want to see? And so the fact that there's, basically I didn't have to choose, right? I didn't have to choose to be a theorist or to be somebody who's more active in the policy realm. I got to choose a subject matter where it felt like I could operate at many different levels of analysis, and that was something that was really attractive to me. Teaching about, so it's in flux is what I will answer, partly because I've been doing a lot of rethinking about how I teach these things. And when I say that, what I mean is that there is a orthodoxy around nuclear deterrence, and it is something that on the one hand is very important to teach, convey, and make sure that students who you are giving either the skills to become experts in the nuclear realm or just to become informed citizens who, especially, I teach in a state that has nuclear weapons. I'm from a state that has nuclear weapons, right? So you want an informed citizenry because these are the voters, these are democracies who are going to make decisions about, do we reinvest and recapitalize in our nuclear deterrent or not? So you really want people to be able to understand, what is nuclear deterrence? How does it operate? What does it mean when someone says mutual assured destruction? All of the basic concepts associated with it. And so it's always tempting to start there when you teach nuclear issues. But there's some limitations to that as well. One is time. We never have enough time to cover everything we want to cover in any one class. And so where you start also is what you prioritize. And so sometimes you may not get to talk about everything else you want to talk about within a semester. Another reason is that there is something that's extraordinarily seductive about the logic of nuclear deterrence, but I would like students to be able to also see its limitations, see around and outside of it. And a lot of the ways that you do that are by introducing students to the kinds of stories that are much more human stories that people tell about the damage that was done either through nuclear use or through nuclear production. Stories about environmental pollution, about sickness, and about the costs associated with maintaining arsenals. I think one of the things that happens in deterrence is that the arsenal exists as if it's disembodied and it has no costs associated with it. Whereas there are many costs, not only associated with nuclear war, which deterrence is designed to prevent, right, but also associated with the maintenance and production of nuclear arsenals, especially the scale that we saw during the Cold War. So one answer is thinking through where do you start, right? Also, the students we teach these days, they mostly were born after the Cold War, right? So even just now, you could take my generation, you could take for granted that people understood a lot about the Cold War. Now you have to go back and teach some of that history as well. The other thing I'll say is that I do try to incorporate active learning exercises into my classrooms, because insofar as I do want to also prepare people for the workforce, whether that's nuclear specific or not, having the experience of simulating negotiations, crisis decision making, and then writing up the kind of documents that you might produce in a professional context, not only term papers, which I also ask students to write, but policy documents, policy memos, letters home to a head of state, things that people might produce if they were hired to work on issues that were at this intersection of policy and technology and international politics, whether it be in climate politics or nuclear politics or cyber, teaching students some of the skill sets that they would need to do that kind of work as well. The public should care about nuclear weapons because regardless of whether or not they are at the forefront of a very crowded media environment, they're always there in the background. And our nuclear policies require an incredible amount of vigilance. So nuclear weapons are dangerous objects. They're incredibly dangerous. And we have many of them on the Earth. Even since the drawdown at the end of the Cold War, the height of the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union had 70,000 some weapons between them. That could destroy the Earth many, many times over. And one of the major policy initiatives in the US at the end of the Cold War was figuring out how to secure the nuclear weapons that were being left behind in former Soviet states during the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? They're dangerous objects. And the more states that have them, the more these objects are spread around the world. And so the public should care because regardless of what the current issue is, and today the current issue is Russia and its invasion of Ukraine and what that means for the US-Russian relationship in terms of the resurgence of arms racing, in terms of the operation of nuclear deterrence in the context of a current conflict, whether it's North Korea and provocations around new nuclear tests or missile tests that are associated with their nuclear program, whether it's Iran pushing the boundaries diplomatically around what is or isn't allowed under the nuclear nonproliferation regime and their commitments there. There's always another issue, but in the background, there's the fact that this is something that nuclear weapons are something that are very dangerous and that we always need to be looking out for. And at the end of the day, my own maxim in terms of what principle guides my own point of view and opinions on nuclear issues is this idea that they're dangerous objects. And so I tend to come from a school of thought where I think having fewer of them in the world is better because humans are flawed. And as much as we may want to create systems that are exacting and that actually implement vigilance on a level that's capable of keeping us safe, we both have those systems set up in a way that's potentially explosive, but also those systems can fail. And so whenever I look at policy situations, I ask this kind of question of how few nuclear weapons are necessary, how few nuclear weapons could we live with, what can we do to make nuclear disarmament something that is a more achievable and viable, realistic goal.
Um,
The current issue or trend that concerns me is not necessarily something that, I mean, obviously current events, the war in Ukraine, the potential for nuclear saber rattling between Putin and US leadership, currently President Biden. But more than that, what concerns me are the longer term trends towards the recapitalization of nuclear programs in many states. We've had debates about recapitalization that have mostly been concluded in favor of reinvesting large sums of money in both the UK and the US in replacing and upgrading a lot of the delivery systems associated with nuclear weapons, if not the weapons themselves. And that's something that concerns me, because I think that it is money that could be spent elsewhere. And as I've talked about already, there are lots of costs associated with producing and maintaining the arsenals that are human and environmental costs that these recapitalization programs may or may not take into account. And so as much as there are things that are capturing the headlines at any one point in time, there's also this entire architecture and infrastructure that is continuing to invest in a system that we already know results in large-scale arms racing under tense conditions and international pressure. And so I think the longer term trends, we need to ask questions about how we maybe would be able to do this differently or better.